Tennessee This Week from WATE's 6 on Your Side starts now.
Memories of a leader, the late Senator John McCain. And Glenn Jacobs is now the mayor of Knox County. We are looking into that transition. Plus the ads for November starting already coming up on Tennessee This Week. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tennessee This Week. I'm Kristen Farley. Well, we are remembering the life and legacy of Senator John McCain. ABC's Kenneth Moten takes a look back.
He was a political maverick and a military hero. Over 5 decades, John Sidney McCain III became a towering figure in American politics and public service. Born on a U.S. military base near the Panama Canal, McCain grew up in Northern Virginia, the middle child of 3 in a family of Navy admirals. He attended the Naval Academy and became a combat aviator, flying missions over North Vietnam during the war. In 1967, McCain was shot down, captured, and later tortured, doing 5.5 years in a North Vietnamese jail dubbed the Hanoi Hilton.
So you have to have faith that your country and your countrymen are doing everything they can to bring you home as quickly as possible.
His scars of war became reminders of his valor, a decorated hero who turned to politics as a second calling. In 1982, McCain ran for Congress from Arizona, home to his second wife, Cindy Lou Hensley, a Phoenix school teacher who became his sweetheart after the war. The McCains would raise 4 children, including an adopted daughter from Bangladesh, a tight-knit family that factored prominently in his campaigns. McCain served 5 terms in the U.S. Senate and ran for president twice.
I'm not running for president to be somebody, but to do something.
In 2000, McCain lost the GOP primary to George W. Bush. 8 years later, he staged a storybook comeback to clinch his party's nomination. As candidate, he catapulted Sarah Palin to fame, while in his Straight Talk Express, winning a reputation as a candidate of character. But in the shadow of an unpopular Republican incumbent, McCain struggled to build momentum and at times strike the right tone.
The fundamentals of our economy are strong.
He got overtaken by a resurgent Senate colleague, Barack Obama, who was on a history-making run. True to form, McCain didn't fade away, turning misfortune into the role of elder Republican statesman. A party leader unwilling to bend to pressure. One of McCain's most dramatic acts of defiance, his July 2017 no vote on the GOP's skinny health care repeal. One of several failed attempts to dismantle Obamacare. A staunch critic of Democrats, but never afraid to be a conciliator. A budget hawk who led the charge against Obamacare, while trying to broker an elusive compromise on immigration. But McCain may be most remembered as a fierce advocate for veterans and the military, which he loved. Kenneth Moten, ABC News, Washington.
All right, joining me more now to talk about Senator John McCain, we have WATE 6 on Your Side healthcare analyst Craig Griffith, attorney Terry Adams, and our political analyst George Corda. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome for having us.
Such a legacy that Senator McCain leaves behind. Craig, let's start with you. What do you think people will remember him most for?
Well, of course, right now they're going to remember his thumb down on the repeal of Obamacare, but I think that's only a very small picture of what John McCain was. And I think that he is probably the last of a breed of senators that we'll have that were able to rise above the fray because of his service to his country, his time in the prisoner of war camp. The man can't comb his hair now because of the injuries he suffered back in the Hanoi Hilton. So I think he's able to rise above the fray in a way that we probably won't have many other senators rise to that level now because of his breadth of experience.
And Terry, we're seeing people from both sides of the aisle coming out lauding him for his service to our country and the legacy he's leaving behind. Do you think he truly was someone who could reach across the aisle and get things done?
Absolutely. I mean, and he proved it time and time again. I think one of the things, if looking at his book, talking about, well, if I made a mistake with Palin, it's because I didn't go and get Joe Lieberman, who, you know, was certainly a middle-of-the-road kind of person. And I think that guys like McCain, I disagree with Craig. I think, you know, things happen in cycles. I think we'll have some people like him again, but when you talk about what are we going to remember, I think what we have to remember is that sacrifice, that honor and sacrifice that he made for this country before he was a political figure. That was his platform, and that's what mattered the most.
And George, you actually met Senator McCain years ago. What is your memory like of Senator McCain?
It was very brief, and it was It was one of those moments where it was like when I met Jim Lovell, the pilot or the commander of Apollo 13. You just don't feel like you ought to say anything because of the person in whose presence you are. And the reason I felt that way is because when John McCain was released, I had been from North Vietnamese prison. I'd been in the Army about a year. Now, I was in between wars. I didn't do anything even in the same universe that John McCain did. But I can remember after he was released and the POWs came back, when I would be talking to other guys in the unit, we would wonder, and also when I was in Germany and the Russians were across the border, and there was always a threat of war, if we were captured, could we be like John McCain? Could we do what he did? And I don't know that I could. And if he never did anything else in his life, that was enough. Because he was the standard by which people like me and a lot of other people in the military measured what a true American military member in captivity should and could be.
We actually caught up recently with an East Tennessean, a fellow POW who was once locked up in the cell right next to McCain's. Take a listen.
They asked me, do I know John? I said, yeah. I said I was on his welcome committee. I'd been there 2 years before he showed up. And I think we as Americans will find ourselves asking how Senator McCain would have handled this. And so I really think that he has made an impact on all of our lives.
You know, so many people, when someone passes, talks about the legacy they're going to leave behind, whether it's political or whether it's some other form of career or a good family man. With Senator McCain, we hear a lot of words about character, and I think it's almost undeniable that he showed his character so many times throughout his career. And George, earlier you told me you agree with that.
Well, the character was demonstrated in that as an admiral's son, he was offered the opportunity to be released early by the North Vietnamese. And because the other POWs were going to have to stay, he refused. Now, I don't know how many people would do that, but he did. And that speaks to character. Now, in terms of the political aspect of this, people are politically going to act in their own interest. So they are going to either follow John McCain's example because they think it's in their interest, or they're not because they think it's in their interest. It's just like there are people praising him today who don't really mean it, but they know he criticized Trump, so they're happy about that. Had that not occurred, they might praise him, but not as vocally. And there are those who praise him because he did not go to Washington and go to work for the party leadership, like so many people do. Most people run saying, I'm going to go represent you. And they wind up going to work for the party leadership. He wasn't in that mold. That was what made him different.
Terry, do you think people are watching all of these memorials and the recounting of the stories and the legacy, and that maybe this will spawn, as you said, you think that there are going to be other McCain-like leaders out there? Do you think maybe this will encourage people to kind of come forward and stand their ground on individual issues and not just along their party line?
Oh, I do think so, and I think John McCain was always a reminder that it's not about the party line, and it is about representing those people in your state or those people in your congressional district. And he always did that. He did it during the presidential campaign. He always seemed to be attempting to do the right thing, regardless of whether you disagreed with his politics. You always felt like the guy was doing the best he could, and and I hope and pray that we have more people that are going to come to run for office like that.
Craig, what do you think his absence does to politics right now in Washington?
Well, we're in such a hyper-partisan environment now. It's hard for me to understand how someone with his background, his being a maverick, would come through the ranks of the parties now. It's almost you have to accept the party ideology to get the backing of the party and to get into office. The main thing that people worry about now is being primaried. Not losing a general election, but losing in the primary. So you have to go so far to either the left or the right to win an office that we're in this hyper-partisan atmosphere. And I don't know whether it's going to change the politics at the national level or not. I think we've lost someone who was capable of doing that and had the credentials that very few other Americans have. The very few other Americans can inspire the leadership and can say what he said without being plummeted by the left or the right. So it's difficult to see how someone else is going to arise to this level.
Yeah, and the services for McCain continuing, obviously, through today as well. So, all right, gentlemen, thank you. Still to come, everyone. We want to talk a little bit about a transition in city-county building there. Glenn Jacobs taking over as the Knox County mayor. Stay with us. You're watching Tennessee This Week on WATE 6 on your side.